Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into the world of fruit fly courtship.
Oh, yeah.
You might be thinking, flies, really? But trust me,
It's going to be good.
it's way more interesting than you think.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be using excerpts from the book chapter Love on the Fly
Great source.
to understand how these tiny creatures find their perfect mate.
It's like high school drama,
Haha, real.
but with wings and a whole lot of genetics.
I like that.
Okay.
So let's imagine a bruised peach on the ground.
Yeah.
Not exactly gourmet dining, is it?
Not for us, but for a fruit fly.
Yeah.
That's the place to be. Adult fruit flies aren't big eaters. Their focus is on mating.
It's like their own singles bar.
Exactly. That peach is where they go to mingle.
Okay, so the scene is set, and the flies are ready to find a mate. But how do they even find each other in the first place? Is it just random?
Not at all. Female flies have a secret weapon.
Okay.
Pheromones, they're like a fly's signature perfume. Each species has its own unique scent, and the males can pick it up from far away.
So they're basically advertising themselves with a specific fragrance.
That's it. And the males, they have these super sensitive receptors on their legs, antennae, even their mouth parts,
Wow.
to detect these pheromones. It's like a built-in GPS for finding a mate.
That's pretty impressive. So a male fly gets a whiff of this perfume. Does he just rush in? What happens?
Well, there's a certain etiquette involved. Think of it like a dance. The male has to do a specific sequence of moves to impress the female.
Okay.
First, he orients himself towards her. Then he taps her abdomen with his foreleg.
It's like a carefully choreographed first move.
Exactly. Now, if the female isn't interested, she'll just walk away. But if she likes what she sees, he moves on to the next step, vibrating his wings to create a courtship song.
Hold on. Flies can sing. What does that even sound like?
You probably wouldn't call it music. It's more like a specific buzzing sound. But to a female fly, it's crucial. Think of it like every species has its own unique melody, and the female can tell if the male is the right species just by listening.
Wow. So the male has found a female with the right scent. He's done his little dance.
Mm.
And now he's serenading her with his species-specific tune. It's quite a process.
Yeah.
But is this something they learn, or is it instinctual?
It's actually mostly controlled by their genes.
Oh, wow.
There's this gene called fruitless.
Okay.
And without it, a male fly basically has no clue how to court a female.
So it's like the instruction manual for fly romance.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And get this, if you take that fruitless gene and put it into a female fly,
What?
she starts trying to court other females.
No way.
It's true. It really shows you the power of genes in shaping behavior.
That is wild. So genes are calling the shots in the fly dating scene, but I'm guessing there's more to it, right? I mean, there have to be other genes involved in this whole courtship ritual.
Oh, absolutely.
Like-
There's another one called the period gene. And it's fascinating. This gene is like a biological clock that influences not only the fly's daily rhythms, but also the tempo of its courtship song.
So like setting the beat for their love song?
Exactly. Making sure they're dancing to the right rhythm.
This is incredible. So it's not just about the moves and the scent, but also the tempo. These flies have quite the checklist.
They do.
But what I find really fascinating is that scientists can actually manipulate these genes in the lab.
Oh, yeah. They've done some amazing experiments. For example, they've swapped the period gene between different species of flies. And guess what? It changed the timing of their mating preferences.
Really?
Yeah.
So by changing one gene, they could make a fly more interested in mating at, say, a different time of day.
Exactly.
That's mind-blowing. But why is that so important? Like, what's the bigger picture here?
Well, think about it. If a group of flies start developing slightly different mating preferences, maybe they're attracted to a different scent or they sing their song at a different time, they might be less likely to mate with flies from other groups.
So over time, could these small differences lead to the formation of new species?
Precisely. It's like a gradual shift in their communication styles. And genes like period play a key role in this process.
So these tiny genetic variations aren't just about individual flies finding a mate. They're actually driving the evolution of new species.
Exactly.
That's incredible. Okay, so we've talked about the period gene. Can you give me a specific example of how this might work in the real world?
Sure. Let's consider Drosophila melanogaster. That's the common fruit fly you might find buzzing around your kitchen.
Oh yeah, I know those guys.
And its relative Drosophila simulans, they're very closely related. In fact, they can actually produce offspring,
Okay.
but those offspring are usually infertile.
So there's a risk of them interbreeding and messing up their genes.
Exactly. And that's where the period gene comes in. You see, Drosophila melanogaster and Drosophila simulans have slightly different courtship song rhythms. And that's partly due to variations in the period gene.
So the period gene is like a musical conductor, making sure they're singing the right tune and not accidentally mating with the wrong species.
Precisely. The female flies are very picky about the rhythm of their own species' song. They're less likely to mate with a male who's singing the wrong tune.
It's like a built-in rhythm detector.
Exactly, making sure they're dancing with the right partner. And what's even more amazing is that scientists have actually swapped the period gene between these two species,
Yeah.
and they were able to change the fly's song just by changing that one gene.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So these tiny genetic tweaks can have a huge impact on behavior and ultimately contribute to the evolution of new species.
It really highlights the power of natural selection acting on even the smallest variations, shaping the intricate dance of courtship and driving the diversity of life on Earth.
This is fascinating. It seems like we keep uncovering more and more complexity, but we've been focusing a lot on the genetic side of things. What about learning? Does that play a role in fly courtship too, or is it all just hardwired?
That's a great question. And while a lot of fly courtship is seemingly pre-programmed, doesn't mean they can't learn or adapt to some degree. I mean, even with humans, our romantic behaviors aren't entirely dictated by our genes.
Yeah, that's true.
There's always an element of learning and experience involved. So to study this in flies, researchers have raised male flies in isolation and then observed their behavior when they finally encounter a female.
So they're like fly bachelors, completely clueless about dating.
In a way, yes. But what's remarkable is that even these isolated males still perform the basic courtship steps. It suggests that a lot of the basic program is hardwired into their nervous system. However, researchers have noticed subtle differences between the courtship of isolated males and those raised in a more social environment.
So even though they have the instincts, social experience can still fine-tune their performance.
Exactly. Those flies that have had a chance to observe others or even practice their moves might be more successful in the mating game.
It's like they're learning the art of fly flirting from their peers.
Precisely. And it highlights how even in behaviors that seem largely instinctual, there's still some room for learning.
That's incredible. It seems like the more we learn about these flies, the more complex they become. Speaking of complexity, we haven't talked much about neurochemicals. Do things like dopamine, which we know plays a role in reward and motivation influence, fly courtship?
That's a very interesting question. You'd think that a male fly would get a surge of dopamine upon seeing a potential mate.
Right, because it's a rewarding experience.
Exactly. But research suggests that dopamine might not be as crucial for fly courtship as we might expect.
Really? Why not?
Well, scientists have done experiments where they actually depleted dopamine levels in male flies. And guess what? It didn't completely eliminate their courtship behavior.
So even without that reward signal, they were still driven to mate.
It seems so. It could be that the drive to reproduce is so deeply ingrained in their biology that it overrides the need for a strong dopamine reward. Or it could be that other neurochemicals are at play that we haven't fully uncovered yet.
Wow, it really challenges our assumptions about the role of reward in driving behavior, even something as fundamental as mating.
Exactly. It shows how much we still have to learn about the interplay of genetics, neurochemicals, and experience in shaping even the most seemingly instinctual behaviors.
It's like these flies are playing by a different set of rules, but that's what makes them so fascinating.
It is. The more we delve into these hidden worlds, the more we discover about the principles that govern behavior across species, even our own.
Well, my mind is officially blown. We've talked about pheromones, courtship songs, genes, neurochemicals. It's like a whole secret world happening right under our noses.
It is.
But I had to ask, how do scientists even begin to unravel all of this? How do they figure out which genes are involved in these complex behaviors?
It's a bit like solving a puzzle. Imagine a box full of pieces, each representing a different gene.
Yeah.
And your goal is to figure out which pieces create the picture of fly courtship.
So how do they find those specific pieces?
One way is by studying flies with mutations. Think of it like a puzzle piece that's a little misshapen. It doesn't quite fit right, causing a disruption in the overall picture.
So if a fly has a mutation in a gene related to courtship, its behavior might be different.
Exactly. They might not sing the right song, or they might not even be interested in mating at all. By observing these mutant flies, scientists can identify genes that are likely involved in the courtship process.
So they're looking for the flies that just can't seem to get the hang of the dating game.
Exactly. And by comparing them to normal flies, they can start to understand the specific functions of those genes. It's like a detective story trying to piece together the clues to understand how these complex behaviors work.
It's amazing what we can learn from these little genetic mishaps.
It really is. And this approach has been incredibly successful in uncovering a genetic basis of behavior not just in flies, but in other organisms as well.
That's amazing. Thinking back to our discussion about the fruitless gene, it's incredible how something so small can have such a huge impact on behavior. It's like a tiny switch that completely changes a fly's romantic destiny.
It really shows the power of genes in shaping who we are. And it makes you wonder what other secrets are hidden within our DNA.
It's like a whole universe of information waiting to be unlocked.
Yeah.
But let's zoom out for a moment. We've been talking about fly courtship in a very scientific way. But are there any parallels between their world and our own?
That's an interesting question. And while the specifics of courtship rituals are obviously very different between flies and humans, there are some underlying similarities.
Oh, like what?
Well, both flies and humans rely on sensory cues to assess potential mates. Flies use pheromones and courtship songs. We might be drawn to certain scents, visual appearances, or even the sound of someone's voice.
So even though the rituals look different, we're using those same basic senses to evaluate potential partners.
Exactly. And think about the role of timing. We talked about how the period gene can influence a fly's mating preferences. Well, there's evidence that hormones and biological rhythms also influence human behavior, and even our preferences for certain partners.
It's like we're all influenced by these ancient evolutionary forces, even when it comes to something as personal as love.
Exactly. It shows how connected we are to the rest of the animal kingdom. Even in something as complex as love and courtship, we share some fundamental similarities with these tiny creatures.
This entire deep dive has been incredible. I never thought I'd learn so much about flies.
Me neither.
I mean, they're teaching us about genetics, behavior, even the evolution of new species.
It just goes to show that there's so much to discover in even the most unexpected places.
Absolutely. So the next time you see a fruit fly buzzing around, take a moment to appreciate the complex world of courtship and genetics that's happening right there in front of you.
It's a good reminder that even the smallest creatures can reveal big truths about life.
Exactly. And who knows what other secrets are waiting to be uncovered. There's always more to explore and more to learn about this amazing world.
Absolutely, they do.
It's amazing, though, that scientists can manipulate these genes in a lab.
Oh, yeah. It's led to some really cool experiments. They swapped the period gene between different species of flies, and it actually changed when they preferred to mate.
No way!
Yeah.
So just by changing one gene, they could make a fly more interested in mating at like a different time of day.
Exactly.
That's wild.
Yeah.
But why is that so important? What's the bigger picture here?
Well, if a group of flies starts developing different mating preferences, maybe they're attracted to a different scent or they sing their song at a different time, they might be less likely to mate with flies from other groups. You see how that could be important?
So over time, these little differences could lead to like entirely new species.
Exactly. It's like a gradual shift in communication, and genes, like period, play a key role in that.
So these tiny genetic variations aren't just about individual flies. They're driving the evolution of new species.
That's right.
That's incredible. Okay, so we've talked about the period gene. Can you give me a specific example of how this might work in the real world?
Sure. Let's talk about Drosophila melanogaster. That's the common fruit fly you might see around your fruit bowl.
Oh, yeah, those guys.
And then there's its close relative, Drosophila simulans. They're so closely related they can actually produce offspring, but those offspring are usually infertile.
So there's a risk of them interbreeding and messing things up.
Exactly. And that's where the period gene comes in. Drosophila melanogaster and Drosophila simulans have slightly different courtship song rhythms. And that's partly because of variations in the period gene.
So the period gene is making sure they're singing the right tune so they don't accidentally mate with the wrong species.
You got female flies are super picky about the rhythm of their own species song. They won't mate with a male who's singing the wrong song.
It's like they have this built-in rhythm detector.
That's a great way to put it. They need to be dancing with the right partner. And get this, scientists have actually swapped the period gene between these two species.
Really?
Yeah, and they were able to change the fly's song just by changing that one gene.
Wow. So these tiny genetic tweaks can have a huge impact on behavior. And in the end, they contribute to the evolution of new species.
Absolutely. It really highlights the power of natural selection. Even the smallest variations are important. They shape the dance of courtship and create the diversity of life.
This is all so fascinating, but we've been talking a lot about genetics. What about learning? Does that play a role in fly courtship, or is it all just instinct?
That's a great question. You know, a lot of fly courtship seems pre-programmed, but that doesn't mean they can't learn or adapt. I mean, think about it. Even with humans, our romantic behaviors aren't totally controlled by our genes.
Yeah, that's true.
There's always some learning and experience involved. So to study this in flies, researchers have raised male flies in isolation and then watched what happens when they meet a female for the first time.
So like they're fly bachelors who've never been on a date.
Haha, sort of,
Yeah.
yeah. And what's amazing is that even these isolated males still try to do the basic courtship steps, like it's hardwired into their system. But there are subtle differences between the courtship of isolated males and those who grew up around other flies.
So even though they have the instincts, social experience can help them get better at it.
Exactly. The flies who've had a chance to watch others or even practice might be more successful.
It's like they're learning how to flirt from their friends.
Exactly. And it shows how even in behaviors that seem instinctual, there's still room for learning.
That's really cool. It seems like the more we learn about these flies, the more complex they get. Speaking of complexity, we haven't talked much about neurochemicals. Do things like dopamine play a role in fly courtship?
That's a great question. You would think that a male fly would get a rush of dopamine when he sees a potential mate. Like it's a rewarding experience.
Right.
But research suggests that dopamine might not be as important as we think.
Really? Why is that?
Well, scientists have done these experiments where they actually got rid of dopamine in male flies.
Yeah.
And guess what? It didn't stop them from courting.
So even without that reward signal, they're still driven to mate.
It seems like maybe the drive to reproduce is so strong it doesn't need a dopamine reward. Or maybe there are other neurochemicals involved that we don't know about yet.
Wow, it really makes you think about what drives behavior, even something as basic as mating.
I know, right? It shows how much we still don't know about how genetics, neurochemicals, and experience all work together.
It seems like these flies are playing by a different set of rules than we thought.
It's true, but that's what makes studying them so interesting.
Definitely. The more we explore these hidden worlds, the more we discover about behavior across species.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what other secrets are hidden in our DNA. Like it's a whole universe of information just waiting to be unlocked. But let's zoom out for a sec. We've been talking about fly courtship in this very scientific way. But are there any interesting parallels between their world and ours?
That's a fun question. You know, while the specifics of courtship are very different between flies and humans, there are some interesting similarities.
Oh yeah, like what?
Well, both flies and humans rely on a combination of sensory cues to assess potential mates. Flies use pheromones in courtship songs. We might be drawn to certain scents, visual appearances, or even like the sound of someone's voice.
So even though the rituals might look different on the surface, we're still using those same basic senses to evaluate potential partners.
Exactly. And think about timing. We talked about how the period gene influences a fly's mating preference. There's actually evidence that hormones and biological rhythms influence human behavior too, even our preferences for certain partners.
Wow. So it's like we're all influenced by these ancient evolutionary forces, even when it comes to something as personal as love and attraction.
It really shows how connected we are to the rest of the animal kingdom. Even in something as complex as love and courtship, we share some fundamental similarities with these tiny creatures.
This whole deep dive has been such an incredible journey. I never imagined that flies could teach us so much about genetics, behavior, and even the evolution of new species.
It's amazing, right? It just goes to show that there's beauty and wonder to be found everywhere, even in the most unexpected places. And by studying these often overlooked creatures, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity of life on Earth.
So the next time you see a fruit fly buzzing around, think about the complex world of courtship and genetics that's happening right there in front of you.
It's a good reminder that even the smallest creatures can reveal big truths about the world.
It really is. And who knows what other secrets of the fly world are out there waiting to be discovered. There's always more to explore and more to learn about this incredible planet.
Absolutely.